Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fokowski, and today we're going to be talking about the rise of democracy and sort of going out with the establishment and the Federalists and in with the new. So with that said, let's talk about what we've discussed thus far in this course. We've talked about the colonies with Jamestown, Plymouth. We've then transitioned to the French and Indian War, and that leads into the struggle for independence and the American Revolutionary War. And then by the 70s and 80s, we have the Articles of Confederation, which don't really work out. So we devise a new constitution, and then we write the Federalist Papers, and we get it ratified, and then George Washington becomes our first president in the 90s, helping to shape the country. And then by the late 1790s, we have Adams dealing with a whole host of foreign affairs, such as the XYZ affair. And then by the 1800s, we have a wave of Democratic Republican presidents from Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, and they deal with a whole host of issues where they basically abandon the Republican principles such as neutrality or staying out of the economy, and nonetheless they get involved with the Barbary States and the Embargo Act and eventually the War of 1812. And that brings in Madison, and we have the rise of nationalism and sectionalism and the era of good feelings, which is done and over with thanks to the bank panic. And now here is our new era, the rise of mass democracy in 1824 through 1840. And prior to this point, you would never ever see someone really holding a baby like this. So if you look at this nice little picture of George Bush holding a baby, you typically didn't have presidents bonding with the average person, especially during a campaign. But now this is sort of commonplace. Barack Obama does it. Every president's going to do it, right? They're a person of the people. So, who is really responsible for that? It's actually really Andrew Jackson. Again, prior to this point, people really didn't interact with the average person. Politics was a person of the elite. If you weren't in that elitist circle, sorry, we don't really care so much about you. So, what brings about this is the election of 1824. We have a number of Democratic Republicans who are running for president. The Federalist Party is basically no longer in existence. We have John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. We have Henry Clay, remember our war hawk. We have Andrew Jackson, our hero from the War of 1812. We have another man named Crawford from Georgia, who's pretty much irrelevant, but I'll mention him anyways. And the thing is, we have all these candidates who are Republicans, but as to their true political identity and where they stood on all these issues, it's really unknown. Jackson was very popular in the West. He railed against corruption and privilege in government because that is not fair to the average person. And he does do fairly well in the polls, but he doesn't do well in terms of the electoral college. And there's going to be a deadlock between three main candidates. And ultimately, we know, thanks to the 12th Amendment, that the House of Representatives gets to choose amongst those candidates. Henry Clay is very influential in the House of Representatives. Think about the deal that he brokered between the North and the South of the American system. So Henry Clay is going to play a hand in who gets elected in 1824. He's actually going to sway Congress. So our three candidates at this point: Crawford, who actually suffers a stroke, so he's irrelevant. And this basically leaves Jackson and Adams. Well, Clay wasn't a fan of Jackson because he was more aligned with the West. So by process of elimination, this left John Quincy Adams. So as a result, they're both nationalists, they're both advocates of the American system, so Clay will work behind the scenes for Adams to get elected by Congress, and again will become our sixth president of the United States. In return, the Secretary of State, that position who's appointed by the president, is going to go to none other than Henry Clay. And in the past, 3 out of the 4 presidents had been given, who served as the Secretary of State, had eventually become president. So this was seen as sort of a conduit that if you were at least the Secretary of State, you had a pretty good chance of becoming the next president. Interesting. But to an average Jackson supporter, this almost looked like Adams had bribed Clay with his position, in that, hey, Henry Clay, if you help me get elected, in return, I'll give you the Secretary of State position. So this whole debacle is known as the corrupt bargain, as you can see here, depicted here. And this was actually a very common practice in politics anyways. Um, but again, to the average citizen, didn't look so good. But even today, whether it's Barack Obama, George Bush, there's a number of positions that are appointed to loyal party supporters. For example, if you support me as president, well, when I have to appoint an ambassador to Switzerland, I'll give you that job. That's a nice, cushy job. So again, this still happens today, but on a lower scale. So nonetheless, John Quincy Adams, he's the president. He's very good on paper. He's great with foreign policy. He was the former Secretary of State. But he's not really a good president. He's a very lackluster president. It's a good word to describe him. He's not very adept at being a president. He's not really a man of the people. He didn't really care so much about them. And he was even known for his cold personality. I mean, one has the last person who's been elected had a cold personality. It really hardly ever happens. He was also labeled the minority president because under a third of people actually voted for him in the popular vote. So he was nicknamed that. And even though he is accused of the corrupt bargain and he's not very well liked by the Jacksonians, as they're called, he's not really willing to partake in this practice even as president. And even during this time, when there's growing sectionalism and waning nationalism, he's still advocating very nationalistic policies that to the average person they don't really like. For example, he's advocating for support for a national university as well as an observatory for astronomy. And to the average person, this is seen as a waste of public funds. Adams is even, not really well liked in the West either, because he was actually willing to work with the Cherokee Native Americans while the Westers wanted them out, even if that meant murdering them all or starting a war. So this is just a nail in Adams' coffin in the next election. And he was also dubbed a Yankee misfit, as he was from Massachusetts. So John Quincy Adams' 4 years will come and go, and he's running for re-election in 1828. Now, at this point, the party names have changed. They are now known as the National Republicans, who are supporting Adams, and Jackson is known as being supported by the Democrats. Now, Jackson is being presented as this hero from the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans, the common man, right? Even though he was the common man on paper, he was actually a very wealthy planter when he grew up, even though he was the first president, interestingly enough, to be born in a log cabin. But nonetheless, the people vote for him. The average common folk vote for him in droves. There's even the elimination of property qualifications prior to his presidency, so that bolsters his numbers. But this election is very dirty, as every election is, and it will always be. Adams says that Jackson's mother was a prostitute. He also calls Jackson's wife an adulterer. And then on the flip side, Adams is going to be criticized for gambling away the well-earned taxpayers' money and even getting a servant girl for the Russian Tsar when he visited. Again, rumors at best, but nonetheless that was still out there. But Adams will lose this election, and this is really bolsters Andrew Jackson and the common person's power, in that it signals the end of this elitist political leadership, right? I mean, think about the Federalist Party, for example, right? They're very elitist. They don't really care about mass democracy or the common person. Well, now that you have Jackson, people are becoming more involved in politics. Think about how involved some people are with politics today. People are readily involved. They write to editorials. They, if you look on the television, they're polling the average person. But prior to this point, the average person isn't really concerned too much with the politics and the person running for president. So in many ways, Jackson is an atypical president. He's very tall, he's very lean, and he also almost appears very emaciated. This is due to issues when he was younger. He had tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery. He even had 2 bullets lodged in his body because he was a very contentious and he had a very violent temper. He was even orphaned as a kid. Again, very much involved in duels, had been stabbed. I mean, this guy is very, very atypical. He's also the second president, interestingly enough, without a college education. Can you guess who the other one was? Yes, it is Washington. And he's also the first president from the West, and he was a slave owner. So some interesting tidbits about him. But when he is inaugurated, people are coming in the masses. He is the common person. People want to see their common man come to office, represent them. To conservatives in the North, your national Republicans, they see him as the king mob of vulgarity, who is replacing the simplicity during the Jeffersonian republics. So some conservatives are fearful that the French Revolution and what that created was going to occur in the United States. Very far-fetched, but nonetheless interesting. But you see this picture of Andrew Jackson. Notice that you have people gathered around him, eager to take a look at him, and this is the spirit of mass democracy. If you look back to slide number 5 and read this personal voice by Mrs. Samuel Harrison Smith, it basically says how eager people are to shake hands with Old Hickory, his nickname, and that people are crammed in just to get a look. I mean, that still happens today, and Jackson is the first one to really do that. So it's very, very impressive on his part. So in our next lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the more controversial aspects and events during Jackson's president, rather. So we'll detail that for you later.